Newsfirst, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
And a very good evening to you and welcome to Newsline Zoom. Our guest this evening is a retired former senior deputy governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Dr.W.A.Wijewardena. Very good evening to you, Dr. Wijewardena.
Good evening, Faraz.
And thank you for being on Newsline Zoom. This timing, of course, is temporary until the football schedules permit us to get back to our normal timing at 8:30 p.m. on TV1. Thought I'd just say that. Now, Dr. Wijewardena, food inflation and a currency crisis is said to be challenging Sri Lanka's economic revival. On top of that, we noticed that the governor of the central bank is threatening to name and shame, quite literally, those people who he says are hiding the dollars overseas, the exporters. Some exporters, according to the governor, are hiding money overseas or not bringing it back anyway. What's the score? How serious is the situation with Sri Lanka supposed to be the country, the sixth highest country at risk from food inflation? And ahead of us is countries like Zimbabwe, for example.
Well, if we look at the current food situation in Sri Lanka, we are heading towards a major humanitarian crisis. In fact, everybody knows that the main culprit of the current food crisis in Sri Lanka has been the attempt by the previous President Dr.W.A.Wijewardena at converting Sri Lanka to organic farming overnight by banning the chemical fertilizers and also pesticides, which has affected not only the subsistence agriculture, but also the plantation agriculture. So as a result, Sri Lanka's food production has declined. And on top of that, the prices have increased. Now, if you look at the food security for us, the definition of food security is the affordability of the required food items by a majority of people. We call it inclusive population, affordable price, number one. Number two, the food should contain all the necessary nutrients that are needed for a person to maintain his health. So that means the certain amount of carbohydrate, about 30%, protein about 30%, and then the fats about, say, another 30%, then the minerals and vitamins another 10%. So that must be the normal diet of a person. And if we don't get that type of a diet, in fact, our food security has been increasingly threatened. So we have been threatened by both. Number one is the foods are not available, as you have said, at an affordable price. Number two is even the available food doesn't contain all the nutritional requirement which a person might need to maintain a good health. So we are heading towards a very, severe humanitarian crisis unless we are being helped by outside agencies like the World Food Program and also the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Bank, ADB, and friendly countries like India and Japan. We are heading towards a major food crisis today.
And we are also being warned, or the world, in fact, is being warned, that Sri Lanka is one of those few countries that are likely to suffer from a currency crisis. I thought we already are suffering from a currency crisis.
We have already suffered. I mean, you don't have to warn that we are going to suffer for us. We are already in the currency crisis, and we had been in the currency crisis from around, say, year 2020 when Governor Lakshman was the governor of the central bank. And from that day onward, we have not taken any action to resolve the currency crisis. And as a result, the situation had deteriorated year after year. And today, our foreign reserves are actually at zero level on a gross basis. But on a net basis, our central bank is indebted to the rest of the world, about, say, $6.2 billion US. So as a result, our foreign reserves are negative to the extent of about say 4.5 billion US dollars.
Yeah.
So we don't have any exchange to maintain our import program, essential imports, food, medicine, fuel, cooking gas, and also raw materials for the
Yeah.
industries. And as a result, we are deep into a currency crisis today.
And what's the way out, Dr. Wijewardena? What's the way out? What is the most sensible way out?
Well, the most sensible way out was a few months back to get an IMF bailout facility as quickly as possible. But now, of course, in my view, even an IMF bailout facility will not help Sri Lanka because it is getting delayed, mainly because one of the preconditions for the bailout package is that Sri Lanka should go for a debt restructuring program with both commercial and bilateral creditors. And that cannot take place mainly because of the intransigence of China, which does not want to agree with the rest of the creditors for a haircut in the total debt they own for Sri Lanka. So as a result, they are willing to give us a new loan and to enable Sri Lanka to repay the old loan. And as a result, it will be a new loan in the books of Sri Lanka. It will not actually reduce Sri Lanka's foreign indebtedness. Instead, it will perpetuate Sri Lanka's foreign indebtedness. So because of this intransigence of China, it has become practically impossible for Sri Lankan authorities to get together and get a consensus view from the commercial creditors as well as the bilateral creditors for a debt restructuring plan. The longer it is delayed, the more time it would take for Sri Lanka to get this IMF bailout package. Now, as it is, even though the governor of the central bank is, confident that we might get it at the end of February, it is unlikely that you get it at the end of February. In my opinion, it might be even later than the June next year.
I know that the governor of the central bank must always remain positive, at least in public utterances. But I can't help pointing out that the governor did say a couple of months ago that subject to these negotiations, that he was confident that we may have at least the first tranche in place by the end of December. Is that unlikely
end of December
now?
is totally out because even President and Finance Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has said it in Parliament that he won't be able to get it in end of December. His timeline was the first quarter of 2023. In my view, even first quarter of 2023 is not possible because we may not be able to get this debt restructuring plan in place to satisfy the IMF board of governing IMF executive board to have the new extended fund facility approved by IMF.
Right.
So even if we get the first tranche for us, that will be around 360 million US dollars, which is a peanut compared to the total foreign exchange requirements that runs into billions, about say 8 billion in US dollars in the next 12-month time period. So therefore, unless we get some bridging financing from ADB, World Bank, and friendly countries like India and Japan, we will not be able to survive the next 6-month time period. So therefore, we are actually in a very critical situation with respect to our foreign exchange crisis today.
I'll come back to another point, but I'd like to ask you, how serious is this situation where exporters, according to the governor of the central bank, are not bringing back all the money that they are selling outside? How serious is that issue?
Well, that has been a charge that has been leveled against exporters. Exporters are under-invoicing their foreign exchange earnings, and importers are over-invoicing the foreign exchange payments. By doing that, they are actually accumulating the country's valuable foreign exchange outside Sri Lanka. This is a charge that has been leveled against the importers and exporters throughout the post-independence period.
Right.
And of course, in the old Exchange Control Act, the main armament that the Act had used to prevent this kind of a situation is called the repatriation and the surrender requirement. Repatriation means that the exporters will have to bring back their export earnings within 6 months. Surrender requirement means that they have to sell it to a official source immediately after they receive it. And these surrender requirements and the repatriation requirements were suspended after Sri Lanka went for the open market economic policy in 1978. There was pressure exerted on Governor Rasaputra, Governor S. Wijewardena, and even Governor Sunil Mandis to reintroduce the surrender requirements and the repatriation requirement, but they resisted because, in their opinion, what they said was a person has incentive to keep money out if and only if the country's macroeconomic situation is fragile. So the macroeconomic situation is fragile because the central bank has not taken action to make the macroeconomic situation healthy for the country. So what they said was, for the fault of the central bank, you cannot penalize the exporters, and therefore they resisted. But the surrender requirement and the repatriation requirements were reintroduced during the Japan government of 2015 to 2019. In 2016 by Finance Minister Ravi Karunanayake, when Arjuna Mahendran was the governor, and that was the wrong decision taken by the Japan government. Now, today, it is the same repatriation and the surrender requirement which is being used by the central bank to highlight that the exporters are keeping this money out. But if you look at the balance of payments data, what we find is that if they are doing systematically, they are keeping money out. The importers are by over-invoicing imports, exporters by under-invoicing exports. Then there should be a huge balance in the gap in the balance of payments for the errors and omissions. And that particular balance has not been systematically in one direction. In some years, it is in the credit, it's a credit balance. In some years, it has been debit balance. So what it means is there had not been a systematic attempt by exporters to keep this money out. So what we therefore see is that Sri Lanka is having a low level of exports, and as a result, we are earning a less amount of foreign exchange earnings, and those monies are not being brought to Sri Lanka by the relevant people who have earned them, because they don't trust the government of Sri Lanka or the central bank of Sri Lanka. So the fault is with the central bank rather than with the exporters.
But what frustrates a governor of the central bank to come out and use this the stick of naming and shaming? He hasn't named them yet, but social media have their own interpretation of who these people may be. Isn't that detrimental to the corporate bodies concerned?
Well, of course, you are correct. It is detrimental because a governor of the central bank should be viewed by the economy as an independent and objective person. When you take the side of one side, and when you start, blaming the exporters and importers for practicing wrong things, instead, making it a public announcement, he can get the customs to do a thorough investigations and find the culprits and punish them. So instead of doing that, when he makes this public announcement, what would happen is, as the social media has already captured it and they have started naming their own enemies or people whom they don't like as the culprits, and they have now become victims. And when the major exporters are being named like that, it's not for the best health of Sri Lanka's export sector in the future.
On that note, let's go for a quick break, and we'll come right back with our guest this evening, Dr.W.A. Wijewardena, retired Senior Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. We'll see you on the other side of the break.
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
And welcome back to Newsline Zoom. Our guest today is the retired former senior Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Dr.W.A. Wijewardena. Dr. Wijewardena, so you don't think that that there's money actually being held outside in any great or significant numbers.
It is something that is happening in all the countries in the world, and therefore we cannot say that Sri Lankan exporters and importers are not resorting to this kind of practices. But of course, to say that the exporters in general and importers in general have been to this practice is not a good idea. And a central bank normally does not make that kind of an announcement. Instead, what the central bank should do is central bank should get the law enforcement agencies. In this case, basically the customs department will have to do a thorough investigations about the under invoicing and over invoicing. And if they find any importer for over invoicing and any exporter for under invoicing, the custom has enough powers to take penal action against them. So I don't think a governor of the central bank should come on media and make this announcement, threatening that he would name and shame these people, which is not good for the country's export sector and the industrial trade sector in general.
Now, how do we get out of this current crisis? I know that the CEO of a bank recently suggested that we need big FDIs in the country. But you know, after all these years where foreign direct investment has actually been in comparative to our region, has been rather poor, putting it mildly. But what needs to be done, Dr. Wijewardena, in your opinion?
Immediately, what the central bank has been doing right now, by curtailing the import flow of the country, is a must. Because it cut down the import flow, and as a result, we have been able to generate a very small surplus in the trade account in the last 2 to 3 months time period. But you cannot continue with that permanently. Then we must have the medium to long-term plan by the government, where the government has a strategy to increase the foreign exchange earnings. So it has to identify which sectors it would support for this purpose, whether it is the currently we have the merchandise exports, where we have the tea, rubber, and coconut and apparel as the major foreign exchange earners for the country, and problems that they are facing in the global market. Because I find that most of the apparel manufacturers in Sri Lanka, they are shifting their manufacturing facilities from Sri Lanka to countries like Bangladesh and also East and the West African countries. So we'll have to get them back to Sri Lanka so that they would be able to export more from Sri Lankan soil, so that we will be earning more foreign exchange on account of the merchandise exports. Then we have to concentrate on the services. In the case of services, the most important service that we can sell in the immediate future is the information and communication technology services. Where we have the people in Sri Lanka, but of course we'll have to be connected to other service providers in India, Israel, and also Ireland, so that we'll be supplying them with a part of the developments that they are making, and we are becoming a part of the global network of ICT services. And as you have said, in the long run, medium to long run, we'll have to attract more foreign direct investment. For that purpose, there are basic ground realities that are necessary. One is the protection of the property rights. Second one is the observance of the rule of law, which the present government has been accused by many for violating it. And then the maintenance of the law and order, and with an independent judiciary, and that is a must, because for any foreign direct investor of worthwhile proportion to bring his direct investment, we must assure that he will be able to do his business without any problem. So because of these reasons, the ground realities have to be first put in place by the government, and then we can think of promoting the foreign direct investment. So those are the things that we can do from medium to long term, but this is a must. But what is necessary is that the government headed by President Ranil Wickremesinghe should come
Yeah.
with a roadmap outlining what is planning to do in the next 10-year time period to promote the country's foreign exchange earning capacity. And that roadmap has to be introduced immediately with appropriate milestones and with an appropriate timeline.
And Dr. Wijewardena, as you observe matters as a senior man and a lifetime at the central bank, do you feel that the central bank can't do more because it isn't really independent in that way, and that in Sri Lanka, within our structure, the central bank is an extension, so to speak, of government?
Well, the present management of the central bank headed by Governor Nandalal Veerasinghe exercises a great degree of independence. And I like to give him a bouquet of flowers on that ground. Then the main reason for the violation of the independence comes from the Secretary Minister of Finance, but the present Secretary of Ministry of Finance, Mr. Mahinda Siriwardena, former central banker, he has also been working in the IMF. Therefore, he is fully aware of the intricacy of dictating terms to central bank, and therefore he has become a collaborating partner of the central bank today. So, in my view, the present management does it well, but of course, we cannot trust the governments in power, because the governments in power always want the central bank to print more money and give that money for them to spend. Now, for example, President Ranil Wickremesinghe, in his first speech in Parliament as the Prime Minister, what he said was he wants the central bank to print 1 trillion Sri Lanka rupees and give to him so that he can pay the salaries of the government servants. Now, you can see now when the central bank does that kind of an operation, there will be a monetary explosion in the future, and present inflation at 70% will in fact be doubled within the next 2 to 3 year time period. So instead of cutting down the expenditures of the government, what the President Ranil Wickremesinghe says is that he needs to get the central bank to print money and give him. Now, these are the things that would force central bank to compromise its independence. And I hope that the current governor and the monetary board will be able to stand with such pressure coming from the government.
But sometimes we out here in the public, we sort of discover a anomaly, and it's like sort of empty promises. For example, some months ago, until recently, the governor of the central bank has been saying that there won't be any sort of domestic debt restructuring. Nothing actually has been put out, I suppose, in writing to reassure the banks and other financial institutions and so on. And now there are rumors, and we are met with radio silence. What is the real position in your estimation?
The definition of debt sustainability is that the borrower, in this case the government of Sri Lanka, be able to repay the principal and pay interest without resorting to extraordinary means or without having to default it. This extraordinary means is that if the government has to get the central bank to print money in order to repay the debt and pay interest, then it's an extraordinary one, then our debt is not sustainable. And to his credit, Governor Nandalal Veerasinghe is doing his best to avoid this, because he has increased the interest rates on government paper to about, say, 30 to 32% from about 12% previously. And he's trying to get everything from the market. But we find that even the market is drying up now. In the last few auctions that we had, he has not been able to get the full amount from the market. And as a result, part of that had to be supplied by the central bank by printing new money. Now, if this is occurring, then Sri Lanka's domestic debt is also bound to be categorized as unsustainable. If it categorized as unsustainable, then nothing can be done by governor or the government with regard to that, because the foreign creditors will ask that if the domestic debt is not sustainable, why should they bear
Yeah.
a haircut? So they might ask the domestic debt also to be subject to the same restructuring process. But what happens is that now presently the Central Bank of Sri Lanka holds about 2.4 trillion Sri Lanka rupee worth of treasury bills from the government. And also equivalent amount is being held by the National Savings Bank, EPF, ETF, Bank of Ceylon, People's Bank, and the banking sector. If there's a haircut coming, maybe say about 30% haircut on the domestic debt, the biggest loser will be the central bank, because central bank will have to lose about 720 billion Sri Lanka rupees, and it will completely wipe out the central bank's capital base. And similarly, it will wipe out the EPF capital base, the NSB capital base. So the government has a serious problem with respect to domestic debt restructuring. So in my view, what the government should do is, government will have to take all the action necessary to prevent Sri Lanka being categorized as an unsustainable domestic debt.
We've only got a few seconds left, about 30 seconds, I suppose. But there's also this other matter about, the additional taxes that they've announced. It's unlikely that they are going to raise and collect as much money as they need to meet government expenditure.
Well, that's also perfectly correct, because the total burden for the Sri Lankan citizens is not the taxes they pay in the current period. The total burden is the total government expenditure, and that amounts to 7.9 trillion Sri Lanka rupees for 2023. But even then, that is by omitting the requirement for the government of Sri Lanka to reissue the treasury bills amounting to 3.8 billion. So when we add both the total liability of the Sri Lankan citizens to maintain the government of Sri Lanka is 11.7 trillion Sri Lanka rupees. And as a result, the burden is much more than what is being perceived by people as the current tax payments.
A lot of hard work still to be done then, Dr. Wijewardena.
Well, not only hard work, we have to make the supreme sacrifice, all of us. Like the Japan, which has been hit by the atomic bomb after the Second World War. Japanese people work for nothing for 6 months sometimes, and they recreated the Japanese economy. So similarly, Sri Lankan people also, including the president himself, down to the man in the street, will have to make the supreme sacrifice, and it is the duty of the President Ranil Wickremesinghe to prepare Sri Lanka's nation to meet this particular hardship in advance, so that we'll be able to go through the process.
Dr. W.A. Wijewardena, thank you very much for being on Newsline Zoom. We much appreciate that. We come to an end of Newsline Zoom. We'll announce to you the timings when the program is going to be on. You can follow us through our links, which will be available by the SMS alert service and so on, and also on social media. Take care. Have a great evening ahead of you. And as always,
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.